Hello and welcome. My name is Melanie Ross, and I'm going to be the facilitator for this webinar today, filling in for David Feist. Our presenter today is Gideon Richards. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on ESG Standards and Guidance, Greenwashing or a Positive Principled Approach. Please note we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that are asked. Our presenter today is again Gideon Richards, and he is an IWA 48 lead technical editor. He's also participated in standards development like ESG CCTG1 as a convener, SAGE, ISO working groups, and the UK Mirror Committee chairs. He's a scheme owner for Microgeneration Certification Scheme, as well as many other accomplishments. I'd like to welcome Gideon and thank him for presenting this webinar for us today on the ESG IWA 48 standard. Gideon, I'm going to go ahead and pass the ball to you.
Thank you for that, Melanie. That's really kind of you. I'm not seeing myself as a host, but I hope I am, so I can move the presentation forwards. Just to say that I was a scheme owner for 12 years, and I didn't start off as a lead technical editor. I think the interesting thing was I actually left the room at the wrong time. I was there to protect some of the interests of the conformity assessment world and make sure that the document was developed appropriately. But I've been involved with ESG now for quite a while. Not just in terms of writing documents, but also looking and working with clients in this space. So let's move on and try and get through what is a very big subject in a very short period of time and make sure we've got plenty of time for questions afterwards. So what is ESG? Well, it says here, and this is the IWA 48 description of ESG. We haven't got to a definition yet, but it's about the strategic and operational framework, and it's about implementing and reporting. And I think it's important that we understand that if we want to make this a meaningful exercise, then it's got to be about embedding the ESG into the organization and putting it as part of the DNA, if you like, of that organization. So I believe it's really important, this embedding part of it, and you'll probably hear me say it a lot of times. So I apologize now, but it is part and parcel of ESG, I think, that it's about the operational as much as it is about the report itself. So the question has been asked a couple of times of me recently, will ESG survive? And the answer, I think, is very clear. It will. It may change name even, but it may slightly alter in the way it's being done at the present time. But actually, it's sound advice for all organizations anyway. So for me, the idea of this actually continuing, it's there. Climate change doesn't change, and also nor does sustainability. It's actually going to be the credentials of the future, I think. This document has been developed specifically in mind for SMEs and organizations in low and middle income countries who are growing fast and want to be engaged in this side of the development process. So we'll cover the document. It flows very nicely. We'll cover what's in it, and we'll have a very fast run through how it works, and then we will take questions from you as we get at the end. Thank you. Let me just give you a little bit of background. So IWA is an international workshop agreement. It's a fast track development process for a document, a consensus document. And the IWA 48 Environmental, Social and Governance Implementation Principles was born out of 3 years of work previously looking at what ESG was about, how ISO could fit into that role, and also how it could position itself in a very fast moving market where typically ISO isn't known to be the fastest in developing documentation. So a few quick points here. It's a guidance document. It isn't a requirements document. It was led by the UK, Canada and Brazil. As you can see, it had a lot of participants. It had 5 workshops and 3 drafts. I think the important thing to say is that it is a very fast process, and for the leadership, that was a real headache. But we did get there in the end. It was launched on the 14th of November at COP29. Unfortunately, I wasn't there to be seeing it launched, but in the last 4 months, we've had approximately 17,000 downloads of the document. And I should say that it's freely available for download, and we've got the link in the bottom of the presentation for you. So who's it for? Well, it's for everyone. All sizes of organizations, across all jurisdictions, across all sectors. The document will work for everyone, and it depends on where your maturity is, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on, but where your maturity is in the ESG sector will depend on how you actually use the document and develop. But it's a process, it's a flow from one end to the other, taking you through how to do the ESG. As I said, it's a guidance document, so no mandatory requirements. There's a lot of consider in it, and that's deliberate. It doesn't mean that everything has to be done. It was a question we had while we were developing the document from a couple of people who said, you're putting too much on us to actually deal with. And we're saying, no, it's considerate. If you don't find it's something you need to do, then record that it's not something that you need to do. But be transparent with why you've actually made that decision. And it's about, as I said, embedding ESG into the heart of the DNA of your organization and the leadership. And if that happens, then we believe that the document will have more life and it will be more valuable to the organization. Just remember to read the document as a whole. There's plenty of really good information in the introduction as well. Most people tend to skip the introduction, so remember to read that as well. So let's go into a little bit more detail. Overarching principles are the 6 you can see on the screen, and they are the fundamental point in making sure that there's confidence and trust in everything that's done within the ESG process. Yeah, obviously, integrity is really important. Yeah, focused on an outcome. Make sure that you understand what the outcome you're looking for is before you start, preferably before you start, because if you do that, then it will be easier to steer and direct the organization in the way that you're looking for. But we also have to look at identifying all of the impacts, the risks, the opportunities on the way through, so we can actually then screen them and make sure that they work. So this is the overarching principles. Within the document, you'll find a lot more other principles as well for the different sections of it. and we'll leave you to go through those. And as I said, maturity is there. Maturity in not only your organization, but also in your ESG process. Remember, it's a journey. So as I said, I keep on saying the word process, but it is a process. And we've tried to make it flow from a logical beginning through to the end, and the end being reporting, although there is obviously continuous feedback loops within the process as well. This is actually for one section of it. I've just taken it as an example, but this is for the environmental risk side of it. So remembering that you need to identify what those risks and opportunities, impacts are on the way through before you get to evaluate anything, and you need to work those through as many as possible. And we'll talk about interested parties in a little bit, but it's really important that we know who the interested parties are, because when identifying your risks, your opportunities, and your impacts, you need to consider who that audience is on the way through. Once you've done that and you've got them identified, it doesn't mean to say that every one of them is going to be a priority to you. So then you can evaluate and assess what those impacts are going to be and categorize them and prioritize them. Once you've got those, then you can actually set about having the desired outcomes, an implementation strategy and action plans to actually move things forward. As I said, for me, the reporting is the last part of the process, and it shouldn't be seen as what you're doing ESG for. You know, if you embed it into the organization, then it makes it a lot stronger. And so we need to also think about the data, recording it, and how we actually tell people what we've considered and what the outcomes of those considerations are. So ensure that they're all recorded as well. The strategy, you know, I've got here, it's about leadership. It's from the top down. There needs to be accountability and transparency, but it needs to be right the way through the whole process. It's important that every area of the organization takes ownership of it and buys into it. But to do that, it has to be led from the top, and it needs to convey and act, you know, within those overarching principles. So the document talks about all of these aspects of it. In the front of it, about how you establish the process, and then it goes into the E, the S, and the G to follow through. But remember, there's also cross-cutting areas as well. So to be able to do the ESG, then we need to think about this in terms of the boundaries we're going to set. And here's, I think, is an interesting comment from a book I've been reading. Yeah, all ways of viewing the world are selective. So we have to remember that the ESG that I think is important may be different to the ESG that you think is important and your organization thinks is important. And so it's not just about what the organization thinks, because in reality, you know, this is for other people as much as it is for the organization. So it's for whoever the audience is, and I call them audience because it depends on who those interested parties are, and we'll talk about those. But you know, it can be very different for different people. So you need to be thinking about what the boundaries of the ESG are, and these are changing rapidly, it feels like, at the moment, given how we've established double materiality in Europe and single materiality in other parts of the world, and how that is actually changing and stepping back for who is actually having to do ESG on a mandatory basis. Like I was reading today that the changes in the European directive, the CSRD, will probably reduce down the amount of mandatory reporting by 80%, which is a huge part of this. So understanding who you're actually doing your ESG for, and typically people think of it as for investors and financiers and people like that, but actually we think it's more important for the whole of the business, your clients, and also those external bodies, the community, and everyone else as well. So it's not a tick box exercise. We said this in the document a few times. It really is important to make sure that it's not being done just to get through a hurdle. If you do it that way, you won't gain from the experience and the knowledge that you'll actually benefit from by doing the whole of the ESG process. And it's not just about reporting for the likes of decision makers. You need to be embedding it into the organization, using it as a really powerful tool. It's a foundational building block. It's there to inform and steer the organization's strategy, plans, and functional approach. And if you do that, then it's really going to move the whole dial forward in terms of how you think about your sustainability journey and the ESG maturity of the organization. So we step through it, but we talk about risks and opportunities fairly early on in the documentation, and it's been quite a contentious part of it because risks by some are thought of as both positive and negative. But for the document and for a number of the frameworks, we talk about risks and opportunities. So you need to identify those risks and those opportunities. And you need to be thinking about what it means for your organization, what it means for the community you're in, and also what it means for your clients. So again, it's not just about your own organization and the risk to it. Obviously, there are bound to be physical risks to your organization in some respects. Whether you can, if you're in a floodplain, then you could have risks to your operations. But it's also about how you manage those risks and opportunities. And as I said earlier, we talk about risk appetite in the risks and opportunity section of it, and depending on who you are will depend on what your appetite is. And so you have to remember, as the organization doing the ESG work, that you need to identify all of the stakeholders and understand what their views are as much as what your view is when you're making those considerations of your ESG work. So we've talked about interested parties, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the engagement. There's a big section in there about engaging with interested parties. It's not just about putting a survey out and saying, what do you think about this? It's about understanding all the key interested parties and understanding what they actually want from your organization and what their expectations are. Whether it's health and safety issues or whether it's not living in a polluted environment. There are many different things, and just thinking you can understand them is not good enough. There is an expectation that you will go out there and talk to the interested parties. And that might not be that every individual person, obviously, it's not practical, but it will mean that you cover as many as possible. So it's important to think about those interested parties and also engage them within the organization, within the ESG process and the journey, to make sure that they're actually buying into what you're actually offering and proposing. So interested parties are a very big part of this. And some people talk about intended users. Well, intended users for me can be quite a difficult one, because there's also the unintended users who can also be very much part of the the activities of ESG going forward, because your reputational risks or your financial risk could be at stake if people decide that they don't like what you've done. We talk about financial versus non-financial. We talk about financial impacts and impact materiality. There are a number of different approaches to ESG and the materiality of ESG. And so this document doesn't try and do the financial accounting side of it. It's talking purely about the material impacts. However, they are interdependent. They work together, and without the material impacts being identified and properly accounted for, I can't see how financial impacts can properly be actually assessed and evaluated. So while we may not be talking about double materiality in all parts of the world, and that's inside out and outside in, so we're looking from inside the organization outwards, and what our impacts are on the community and the wider world. We're also looking for double materiality. They're also looking at the outside in. And I think for most people, outside in is going to be an important part of this, because flooding and wildfires, as we've seen already, are all part and parcel of this. But the financial impacts are looking at the financial value. And I think the important part here is that it's not all about the financial value, because reputational damage and other risks to your organization, as we've seen recently with a number of different cases, will be a part of that. Excuse me. So we've mentioned the word materiality a few times. And it's important to understand that when you do your materiality assessment, and this will be for each of the E, S, and G parts of it, and also how it affects your organization in more general terms, you're going to need to think about a number of different issues: where you are, who your audience is for your ESG, what you're looking to achieve by doing the ESG work in the first place. But also, it needs to be identify all of those material activities and impacts that you can. And that's before you even strip them down and say, okay, well, it's never going to happen to us. If you identify them all in the first place, that's the first part of the journey. And then once you've done that, you can then assess them and categorize them and determine through a number of different routes, and there are some examples in the document, how to actually structure your materiality assessment to actually get to a point where you can say, this is the priorities for our organization, this is what we're going to report on, and this is what we're going to embed into the organization's DNA. So the process is there for materiality. It will be part and parcel across the E, S, and G, and there are a number of cross-cutting parts to it as well. But in the document, I'm only going to touch on this very briefly, but there are key performance indicators. But we're talking here about a work in progress. It's the titles that we've got in the document. We haven't got the underlying methodologies and assessment processes, the criteria and assumptions that you should make in there. All of that's to be developed going forward. And I know that there's a lot of people looking to start that work very soon. So we do have key performance indicators. They're not well structured at the moment, but that gives you an indication of the kinds of things that you should be thinking about when looking for to develop your reporting. And I mentioned earlier that there are cross-cutting considerations for all of this. It's very clear that the boundaries between E, S, and G are often very closely matched, and we're talking a lot in the social side of it about the environmental impacts on people. So it's the impact on the people from what's happened, whether it's a wildfire, it's flooding, etc. So you can't just separate the E, S, and G and think of them as totally isolated. You have to think of it in terms of the multi-directional approach to all of this. So I'm just going to touch on each of the E, S, and G now. And really, I'm just trying to give a flavour for the kinds of things that we should be thinking about while doing the assessment. So obviously for environmental, we talk about greenhouse gases. You need to be having a baseline for those, and also setting targets for reductions if that's what is looking to be achieved. Yeah, and many times that is the prime mover for doing an ESG report. But it's also about looking at energy reduction and alternatives to the fossil fuels. It's also about thinking about other things that you can do. Time shifting is getting quite popular, certainly here in the UK. Moving the dial of when you take your energy, so you're reducing the actual intensity of the energy that you're taking. We've got to think about materials and what we're using, whether we can substitute for different ones, how much water we're actually using, and if we can do something differently, and if we can actually use different management processes for that water to avoid pollution. So there's a lot of things to think about within the environmental part of it. Some of them impact on people, obviously, and some of them are impacting on the ecosystem and the biodiversity. But we are a whole planet, and we need to make sure that the ecosystem is in balance going forward. So the environmental side of it, as we said, it flows through doing your assessment, looking at identifying what those risks and opportunities could be, what the impacts of you're talking about as well. From a social point of view, we've broken it down into three particular areas: the internal, so internal to the organization; direct interested parties, so they could be clients, so they could be along the value chain; and then the wider community and society in general. And that's, if you break them down into those areas, you can then start thinking about the different aspects of remuneration maybe, or health and well-being within the organization, but also in the community as well. If your organization is a manufacturer, is it actually affecting the well-being and the health of people around you? I know from my own experience, there is an organization that at the moment is having to think very hard about the flame retardants that it's been producing and the possible impacts of forever chemicals in the watercourse around a site. So there's lots of different areas to think about: human rights, modern slavery, fraud prevention as well, but also about how you handle vulnerable people and the issues that they're going to have with what you do. So within all of this, within the document, there are sections on communication, and there are sections on other aspects that will give you a good grounding in kinds of things to consider. And then we go on to governance. It's about making sure that the vision, the mission, the values of the organization are aligned, not just to the ESG or the ESG to the organization, but also to that outside interested parties as well, or at least that you understand what their view is of all of this. So it's important to make sure that we establish a good grounding in the governance of the organization. As we've said, embedding the ESG into the DNA helps, and also then establishing the strategies and action plans to incorporate the ESG. I wanted to bring this one up because we put in the document compliance and conformity, and we've also added in the governance about in the reporting about assurance, but it still can go wrong. So the idea of having compliance and conformance in a guidance document isn't to say that you need to have requirements that are conformity assessed, or there's compliance against them, but it's to give you an understanding of the kinds of things you would think about if you were that auditor. So if I'm the auditor, and I've done quite a few audits in my time, what would I be looking for as the evidence base, and how would I know that what you've told me is appropriate? And if I can understand that, and if the person writing and working on the ESG can actually demonstrate that, it makes for a lot stronger document. Now, that said, you can see here we've got the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal. It went through a massive process. It went through the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and it came out with flying colors, but actually it was a fiction. And so everything has to be transparent, it has to be accurate, and it has to be honest and with integrity. So the reason we put in compliance and conformity isn't to actually say you have to have your documents compliant and conformity assessed. It's there to help you think about what you would do if you were to get them conformity assessed. So let's just go finally on to reporting, and the last few slides I wanted to pick up on. Reporting, as I said, should be the end of the process for me. It's not the reason for the process. We need to make sure that by doing an ESG activity, that it's benefiting the whole organization and not just providing a report, whether it's mandatory or voluntary on that. And so my comment to you would be, if you want to report it, you have to identify it, understand it, evaluate it, and only then set the priorities and report on them. If you want to do ESG and then you report on it, as some people have to do, it's important that you understand the whole process from top to bottom. And using the likes of constructive challenge structure, which is in the document, you can question everything. Whether you've got the right information in place, how are you using it, whether it's effective. Do you have the right data available to you? How efficient is your plant? All of these things you can break down in every single part of this process to make sure that what you're providing at the end of the day in your reporting is actually something worthy of having in the document. So the reporting principles. We've got the guiding principles, which you can see on the left, and we've got specific principles. The specific principles are things I think we'll all recognise, and we've mentioned them quite a few times. There's accuracy, fair and unbiased, but also there's timely. If you've got a report that needs to go to an organisation and it's going with the accounts, then it needs to be there in the right time frame. If it's going to someone who's making a decision on investing, it needs to be there in the right time frame. So all of these things have to be part and parcel of this, and make sure it's comparable, because when it's being used, it's very likely that what people will be looking at, if it's an investment, at whether they invest in you or someone else. So it's important that it's comparable, and if you can use benchmarks and sector-specific information to do that, that's very helpful as well. In terms of the guiding principles, I think they're all ones we've talked about already. It's the strategic focus and the materiality. But make sure that all the information is there. Why you're actually doing this ESG is an important part of understanding the whole document. But align it with practical operational models and external context. It's no point in actually writing a document that has no bearing with reality. It's all well and good writing something that says that you're great, but as we've seen with the VW process, actually you can get found out fairly quickly. So make sure it's practical, it's real, it's honest, and that the report is evidence-based. So what's the coverage going to be? Well, it depends on the audience. And it may mean that you actually need more than one report for different audiences, I think, is an important part of this. The ESG related activities and issues should actually be mentioned in there as well. You should understand what the environmental and social factors of the ESG are, and actually write them down. Make sure that you're clear, that everyone understands what you're actually talking about. As I said, make sure that it's adapted to the audience. The report covers the materiality, including how you've got to what the materiality was. You write about, you enter the, you fill in parts of it about the organization itself and the governance of the organization, the strategy that you're taking, so people can see that you're actually working in a systematic approach, and that you have an end game to it, and that you look at the risks and you manage those risks appropriately. I mentioned assurance earlier. Again, I say to you that assurance may be appropriate for some organizations, but ESG assurance supports the organization to demonstrate its credibility. So if you are going to actually get a document, your ESG assured, it should give more confidence and trust to those who are actually wanting to use that information. but it's not the only thing that has to happen. You know, assurance will only be required in certain circumstances. Not all ESG will require to be assured, although some people would like it to be. And just thinking about this in a bit of a broader perspective, we're thinking here about the schemes and the directives that are out in the world. You know, we've got IFRS, we've got ISSB, and the ESRS for Europe. The idea of this document is that it is interoperable and it is able to be used with all of the different frameworks, however they're used. So this document should be appropriate for all of your ESG needs. And obviously we will be developing it further as we go along. And it might well become an actual standard in due course. But the important thing to remember is that this is a framework. It's the principles that we're talking about here. And those principles are providing the how-to in terms of the what the actual schemes and directives are actually looking for. So it gives you that structured approach to actually be able to develop an ESG report with confidence. So my final thoughts for you are that it's an important tool for any organization. It's just not there to be meeting some reporting expectations, but to align the organization with the environmental concerns, social and ethical needs of society. The IWA 48 is a supporting guidance document, so there aren't any requirements in it exactly, but it will give you the structure and the approach to doing your ESG from a high level basis. And remember that it's a journey. And as you go through the journey, you get more sophisticated with what you're actually looking at. And whether it's a voluntary process or you have to do a mandatory ESG report, the document is there to help and support. So I'll finish there for now. I think I've had my allotted time, but thank you. And just to let you know that the freely available document, as I've said before, there's a link to it there on the documents. And also, I haven't mentioned it, but BSI have just brought out, this is the UK British Standards Institute, has also brought out the little book of ESG in the last few days. So that one's available for free as well, if you'd like to have a look at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gideon. That was a really interesting presentation and a good overview of the guidance document. We do have time for our Q&A, and we have had a couple questions come in, but in order to give you some more time to generate those questions and enter them into the Q&A box, I just wanted to go over some free resources that ANAB has for you. We have different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On our website, we have some free webcasts on a variety of topics. They're about 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and you can view those at any time. We also have a blog page that contains blogs related to risk and accreditation, standard requirements, and many other topics. One posted recently was talking about OSHA and the top 10 violations that they put out last year. We also do these monthly webinars. We do have a couple more webinars coming up, and one is on the changes to one of the conformity assessment standards. So take a look at our website for our schedule of webinars. Then we also offer training in many different areas, including internal audits, standards, risks, and other topics, such as this guidance document here. We are working with Gideon to put together an overview of this guidance document, so keep a lookout for that as it comes up in the next couple of months. We do offer in-person training as well as live online, and we do have web-based self-paced training as well. All of these resources can be found on our website at anab.ansi.org. So now we will get to the questions that were submitted. Gideon, the first question that was submitted is, in order for an organization to claim that they are IWA 40A compliant, is self-assessment fine, or do they need a third-party assessment for their organization?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I must reiterate, this is a guidance document, so compliance to it is very difficult because there are no direct requirements in the document. There's a lot of follow this route, consider these issues, but it doesn't actually say you must do this and you must comply with it in this way. So I think you're right in terms of when you say self-assessment. I would say that auditing it yourself internally is the way to go about it, especially for smaller organizations. Keep in mind that every step of the process needs to be looked at and checked. If you want to do something in a bit more detail, I know that there is more work going on in terms of developing schemes and processes for self-assessment, and also for a compliance-based route. Until ISO has an actual standard, they would not see this as something that could be conformity assessed in that way. So I think it's presenting your information in the best way possible. It's making sure that you're transparent and you're open with your information, that you allow it to be viewed by other people, and also to do the peer reviewing as well. Use other people and other organizations and share. If you're doing your ESG and someone else wants to do their ESG, even if it's in a different sector, there's a lot of things that can be looked at and maybe peer reviewed. So I would think that that would be a good way of thinking about the whole process at this stage. Third-party assessment for the organization, while there are already many parts of the ESG journey that are already accessible and conformity accessible. And I think that's an important part of it. If you're doing your greenhouse gas analysis evaluation, and you're doing it to 14,064, then you can get assessed to that. So there are a number of building blocks, as we said, to this that will make sure that all of it goes. If you're doing water footprint, or you're doing you're doing an energy audit, all of those can be part of it. They can be actually already assessed, but it doesn't have to be. And from an ESG point of view, the important thing is to have quality data and that transparency to show how you're actually using that data and making an impact. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is, what is your advice for the S&Ms to implement the ISO IWA 48?
Yeah, I saw that one. Hi, Ronaldo. Thank you for the question. I think at the moment, my advice is to know that you're on a journey, to start the steps, building up the information, working on and identifying what the actual impacts are likely to be, or should I say the impacts that could be available, could be part of it, and then building up a profile and mapping those to to the whole process and to the risks and opportunities going forward. I think that's the first part of the journey is really important for that, because if you establish this in the right way, then the rest of it should fall into place.
Right, the next question is, ISO standards can help with systematic approach to ESG. Are you familiar with other standards such as IEC, ISEAL, etc., to be considered in this approach to ESG?
Yeah, I might be a little bit of a maverick on this one, but for me, there are lots and lots of ISO standards that can fit into this, and there's management system standards and there's product standards, but also, as you alluded to, there's a lot of other standards out there. And for me, use the best documentation that works for your organization, whether it's IEC documents, obviously for solar thermals, for solar PV, for wind. There's a lot of information out there, and even other ISO standards. I sit on solid recovered materials committee in ISO, and there is a lot of information and a lot of work going on in how to sample and to categorize your material. So use all of that information and all of those standards to best fit it all together. It's not one document, this, I don't believe. ESG will always be an amalgamation of lots of information, and it's putting that together to demonstrate that what you're doing is appropriate and fits with your vision, your mission, your values, etc. But don't get hung up on having to have, and this is where I'm probably going to be a maverick, having to have all of those standards. For an SME, as Ronaldo asked the question, owning and having all of those documents is just very, very expensive at the moment. And unfortunately, that doesn't help you. What we are looking at in ISO and in the ESG the coordinating committee is actually a way of bringing together a resource hub and a way of digitally looking at what your requirements are and pulling that information digitally into a place that allows you to look at it better. So you'll know what standards to look for. In the back of this document, there's 100 odd standards and documents mentioned in it. If you start working your way through and thinking, I've got to go through all of those, you'll probably put the whole thing down and just go, I can't do it. Especially for a small organization, the resource and time and effort that it takes to do that is really quite intense. And this is one of the reasons why in Europe and places they are already looking at, are we asking too much of the system? So I think, yes, use all of those. If you're already using them, even better. You don't have to actually have new documentation and new processes for all of this. I've always said in my conformity assessment world, use what you've got and make sure that it fits with what you need to deliver. It's fine. I don't care if it's called something else, as long as it's got the information I need and it's accurate.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gideon, for presenting today and for answering the questions. I don't see any others in the Q&A box. So I'll bring up our contact information if you'd like additional information about training or have additional questions about our topic today in our webinar. You can email training@anab.org or anab@anab.org. We appreciate you attending this webinar. And again, Gideon, I appreciate you presenting for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.